The horse, calm until then, became uncontrollable upon seeing her. Its reaction was not of fear, but of a terror that seemed to hide a dark secret. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lexington's rolling hills as Madison Harper stood at the fence of her training track, her eyes fixed on the magnificent thoroughbred galloping before her. Apollo, with his gleaming chestnut coat and powerful stride, embodied everything she had worked for over the past decade. As the horse rounded the final turn, his hooves barely seeming to touch the ground, Madison allowed herself a small smile. In just 3 days, they would face their greatest challenge yet, the Bluegrass Derby. Perfect form as always, isn't he? Thomas, her head trainer, joined her at the fence. His weathered face bore the same expression of admiration that everyone seemed to wear when watching Apollo run. I've never seen a horse with such natural grace. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know from which city you're watching us. Stay tuned. Madison nodded, her attention never wavering from Apollo as he slowed to a trot. He's special, Thomas. We both know it. This isn't just about winning the Derby anymore. It's about proving what I've always believed, that with the right care and training, we can create champions who love what they do. The Kentucky spring air carried the sweet scent of bluegrass and morning dew, a familiar comfort that had accompanied every morning of Madison's journey from amateur horse enthusiast to one of Lexington's most respected breeders. Her farm, Highland Meadows, had grown from a modest operation to a premier training facility. But Apollo was different from any horse she had ever worked with. As the stable hand led Apollo back to the barn, Madison followed, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The horse's ears twitched at her approach, and he lowered his head to nuzzle her shoulder, a gesture that never failed to warm her heart. "That's my boy," she whispered, running her hand along his neck. "You're going to show them all what you can do." Later that afternoon, as Madison reviewed Apollo's training schedule in her office, a steady stream of reporters and photographers filed through the farm. The Bluegrass Derby was more than just another race. It was Kentucky's premier spring event, drawing attention from across the country. Apollo's impressive track record had made him the favorite, and Madison found herself repeatedly answering questions about their preparation and chances of victory. "Miss Harper," one particularly persistent reporter asked, "some say Apollo's racing style is unlike anything they've seen before. How would you describe your training philosophy?" Madison paused, considering her words carefully. "I believe in building trust," she replied, leading the group toward Apollo's stall. "Every horse has a unique personality, unique needs. Apollo isn't just an athlete to me, he's a partner. Understanding that partnership is the key to success." As if on cue, Apollo stepped forward in his stall. His intelligent eyes scanning the crowd, Madison noticed something unusual in his demeanor, a slight tension in his muscles, a new alertness in his gaze. She had spent enough time with horses to know when something was different, but she attributed it to the increased activity around the farm. That evening, after the last of the visitors had left, Madison sat in her favorite spot, a wooden bench overlooking the training track. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a sight that usually brought her peace. But tonight, her mind was troubled by small details she couldn't quite place. Apollo's unusual attention to the crowds, the way he seemed to search the faces of visitors, brief moments of restlessness that were out of character for her normally composed champion. Thomas approached, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. "Big days ahead." "Have you noticed anything different about Apollo lately?" Madison asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Thomas settled beside her on the bench. "Different how?" "I'm not sure exactly. It's subtle. The way he watches people, especially when there are crowds, almost like he's looking for something or someone." "Pre-race jitters, maybe," Thomas suggested. "So even the best horses feel the pressure." Madison shook her head slowly. "No, it's something else. I've seen him before big races. This is different." She took a sip of coffee, letting its warmth chase away the evening chill. "I just can't shake the feeling that there's something we're missing." As darkness settled over the farm, lights began to twinkle on in the stables. The soft sounds of horses settling in for the night filled the air, familiar, comforting sounds that normally helped Madison relax. But tonight, As she made her final rounds, checking on Apollo one last time, she found herself lingering at his stall longer than usual. The horse stood quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the stable lights. When Madison approached, he pressed his nose against her hand, his breath warm and gentle. Everything about him seemed normal. And yet, "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" she whispered, stroking his forehead. "What's going on in that beautiful head of yours?" Apollo's only response was a soft, nickering sound, but as Madison turned to leave, she caught something in his expression, a fleeting look that seemed almost human in its complexity. She had always prided herself on understanding horses, on being able to read their moods and needs, but in that moment, she realized that perhaps Apollo held secrets she had yet to discover. As she walked back to her house, the lights of Lexington glowing in the distance, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The Bluegrass Derby loomed ahead, bringing with it promises of glory and recognition, but something told her that the real story was yet to unfold, a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about horses, about Apollo, and about herself. The day before the Bluegrass Derby dawned with an unusual buzz of activity at Highland Meadows. Madison arrived at the stables earlier than usual, her mind still troubled by the subtle changes she'd noticed in Apollo. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the promise of a perfect day for racing, but something felt off-kilter in a way she couldn't quite define. "Everything's ready for tomorrow," Thomas announced, falling into step beside her as she walked toward Apollo's stall. "The vet's final check is scheduled for this afternoon, and the transport team will be here at 7 sharp in the morning." Madison nodded absently, her attention drawn to Apollo, who was watching the stable entrance with unusual intensity. "Has he eaten this morning?" "Barely touched his breakfast," Thomas replied, concern creeping into his voice. "First time that's happened in, well, ever." The news sent a ripple of worry through Madison. Apollo had always been a creature of habit, reliable in his routines. She approached his stall, and while he acknowledged her presence with a gentle nicker, his attention kept drifting back to the stable entrance. "I want Dr. Reynolds to do a complete check when she comes," Madison decided. "Blood work, the whole 9 yards. We can't take any chances, not with the Derby tomorrow." As if sensing her concern, Apollo finally turned his full attention to Madison, pressing his nose against her shoulder in a familiar gesture of affection. For a moment, everything felt normal again, until a group of visitors entered the stable, and Apollo's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward with startling alertness. "Miss Harper," a woman's voice called out, "sorry to interrupt, but the magazine photographers are here for the pre-race shoot." Madison sighed, patting Apollo's neck reassuringly before turning to face the small crowd gathering at the stable entrance. "Of course. Just give us a few minutes to get ready." As the morning progressed, a steady stream of photographers, journalists, and racing officials filed through the farm. Madison answered their questions with practiced ease, but her attention remained divided, constantly monitoring Apollo's reactions. With each new group that entered the stable, his behavior grew more peculiar, alternating between periods of intense focus and unusual restlessness. During a brief break between interviews, Madison found herself alone with Apollo. She stood before him, studying his face as if trying to read a complex text in a foreign language. "What are you looking for?" she whispered. "Who are you waiting for?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but somehow heavy with meaning. Madison's mind drifted back to the day she'd first seen Apollo, at an exclusive auction in Lexington 3 years ago. She remembered being struck by his presence, the intelligence in his eyes, the perfect conformation of his build. The auction house had provided impressive documentation about his bloodline, but now, thinking back, she realized how little she actually knew about his life before that day. "Madison," Thomas's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Doctor Reynolds is here." The veterinarian's examination was thorough, but revealed nothing unusual. Apollo's vital signs were perfect, his physical condition exemplary. "Whatever's bothering him, it's not physical," Dr. Reynolds concluded, tucking her stethoscope away. "Have you considered that he might be picking up on your anxiety about the race?" Madison shook her head. "We've been in big races before. This is different." She paused. considering whether to voice the question that had been nagging at her. "Sarah, in all your years of practice, have you ever seen a horse? Remember? I mean, really remember something from their past?" Dr. Reynolds gave her a curious look. Horses have excellent long-term memory, especially for people and places associated with strong emotions. "Why do you ask?" Before Madison could respond, a commotion erupted outside the stable. A group of racing officials had arrived for the final pre-race inspection, accompanied by several reporters. As they approached Apollo's stall, Madison noticed a young woman hanging back from the group, partially hidden behind one of the support pillars. There was something about her stance, the way she held herself, that caught Madison's attention. Apollo noticed her too. His reaction was immediate and dramatic, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a strange, almost yearning sound Madison had never heard him make before. When she turned back to look for the woman, she had vanished, leaving Madison with an unsettling feeling that she had just witnessed something significant but incomprehensible. The rest of the day passed in a blur of final preparations and media obligations. As evening settled over the farm, Madison made one last visit to Apollo's stall. The stable was quiet now, the excitement of the day replaced by the peaceful sounds of horses settling in for the night. "Whatever's going on with you," she murmured, stroking Apollo's neck. "Whatever you're trying to tell me, I wish I understood." The horse pressed his head against her chest, and for a moment, Madison felt the weight of unspoken secrets between them. "Tomorrow's our big day, boy. Whatever happens, we're in this together." As she walked back to her house under a sky scattered with stars, Madison couldn't shake the image of the mysterious woman at the stable, or the way Apollo had reacted to her presence. Something was stirring beneath the surface of everything she thought she knew, like a current running deep beneath still waters. Tomorrow would bring the Bluegrass Derby, the race they had spent years preparing for. But Madison had the distinct feeling that the real race, the one that would truly test them both, was only just beginning. The morning of the Bluegrass Derby arrived with a symphony of excitement crackling through the Kentucky air. Madison stood in Apollo's stall, methodically checking every detail of his racing gear while trying to quiet the storm of emotions in her chest. The early morning sun streamed through the stable windows, casting golden bars of light across Apollo's gleaming coat. "Everything looks perfect," Thomas said, appearing at her side with the final paperwork for the race officials. "The transport's ready whenever you are." Madison nodded, but her attention was fixed on Apollo. Something had changed in him overnight. The restlessness of previous days had been replaced by an almost eerie calm, as if he was waiting for something inevitable. His dark eyes seemed to hold a knowledge that Madison couldn't access, and it unsettled her more than his earlier agitation had. The drive to Churchill Downs passed in a blur of nervous energy and last-minute preparations. Apollo traveled quietly in his trailer, showing none of the pre-race excitement that usually characterized him. When they arrived at the track, the scene that greeted them was electric, thousands of spectators already filling the stands. The air thick with anticipation, and the mingled perfumes of mint juleps and expensive cigars. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the grounds, "less than 2 hours until the start of the 149th Bluegrass Derby. And what a day we have in stores with favorite Apollo looking to make history for Highland Meadows Farm." Madison led Apollo through the pre-race procedures with practiced precision, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In the paddock, where other horses pranced and snorted with nervous energy, Apollo remained unusually focused, his attention constantly scanning the growing crowds in the stands. "He's so calm," remarked Jerry, Apollo's regular jockey, as he prepared for the mount. "That's good, right?" "Maybe," Madison replied, though uncertainty gnawed at her. She had learned to trust her instincts with horses, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something unprecedented was about to happen. As they approached the track for the final warm-up, the crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch. Apollo's ears twitched at the roar of applause, but his attention seemed fixed on a particular section of the stands. Madison followed his gaze, and her heart nearly stopped. There, in the third row, stood the young woman from yesterday. Today, she was clearly visible, slender, with wind-tousled dark hair and an intensity in her expression that matched Apollo's. The moment the horse saw her, Something changed in his demeanor. His muscles tensed, and a tremor ran through his powerful frame. "Jerry," Madison called out, suddenly alarmed, but it was too late. Apollo reared up, his movement so sudden and powerful that Jerry barely managed to jump clear. The crowd gasped as the favorite for the Bluegrass Derby began moving against all attempts to control him. His eyes locked on the mysterious woman in the stands. "Apollo!" Madison's voice cut through the chaos, but for the first time since she'd owned him, the horse didn't respond to her call. Instead, he backed away from the track, every movement deliberate and controlled despite the panic erupting around him. The mysterious woman was moving too, making her way down through the stands with fluid grace that seemed impossible in the growing chaos. Security personnel started toward her, but she moved with uncanny precision, always just beyond their reach. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Apollo, displaying strength and agility that even Madison had never witnessed, broke free from the handlers and cleared the barrier between the track and the public areas with a single, magnificent leap. The crowd scattered, screaming, but the young woman walked forward calmly, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "Stop!" Madison called out, running toward them. But her voice was lost in the commotion. The woman reached Apollo, and in one fluid motion that spoke of years of practice, swung herself onto his back. The horse, who had never accepted anyone but his regular riders, stood perfectly still for her, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Their eyes met across the chaos, Madison's filled with confusion and desperate questions, the strangers holding a mixture of determination and what looked almost like apology. Then, before anyone could react, Apollo and the mysterious rider were gone, disappearing through the tunnel that led to the parking areas, leaving behind a stadium full of shocked spectators and a story that would soon make headlines across the country. "Madison!" Thomas reached her side, out of breath. Who was that?" But Madison couldn't answer. Her mind was racing through everything she thought she knew about Apollo, every detail of his past that suddenly seemed suspect. The calm certainty with which the woman had approached him, the instant connection between them, none of it made sense, yet all of it suggested a history she knew nothing about. In the distance, sirens began to wail as local law enforcement responded to the incident. Officials hurried to announce the postponement of the race, while bookmakers dealt with angry bettors and journalists scrambled to capture every detail of the unprecedented event. But Madison barely registered any of it. Her focus was entirely on the tunnel where Apollo had disappeared with his mysterious rider. "Get my truck," she told Thomas, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "And call everyone you know in the local horse community. Someone must have seen where they went." As chaos continued to swirl around her, Madison felt an odd sense of clarity descending. The derby, the crowds, the years of preparation, none of it mattered now. What mattered was finding Apollo and uncovering the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Whatever connection existed between her horse and the mysterious woman, Madison was determined to understand it, even if that understanding would change everything she thought she knew about the champion she had come to love. The aftermath of Apollo's dramatic disappearance from the Bluegrass Derby unfolded like a surreal dream. Madison found herself in her office at Highland Meadows late that evening, surrounded by papers, photographs, and a growing sense that she had missed something crucial all along. The local police had taken statements, but their initial searches had turned up nothing. It was as if Apollo and his mysterious rider had vanished into thin air. "I've got something," Thomas said, entering the office with a stack of security footage from the derby. "You need to see this." Madison moved to the computer as Thomas inserted the first drive. The footage showed multiple angles of the incident, but what caught her attention wasn't the escape itself. It was what happened just before. The mysterious woman had been watching Apollo for hours, her position in the stands carefully chosen. There was nothing random about any of it. "Look at how she moves," Thomas pointed out, freezing a frame. "That's someone who knows horses, really knows them. The way she approached Apollo, how she mounted, that's years of experience right there." Madison nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Pull up Apollo's purchase records." All of them. The documentation from the auction house was extensive, detailing Apollo's impressive bloodline and racing history. But as Madison scrutinized the papers for the 100th time, she noticed something odd, a 6-month gap in the records, just before she purchased him. Thomas, what was Apollo's registration number at the auction? He shuffled through some papers, finding the relevant document, AH2847KY. Madison's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing the National Thoroughbred Database. That's strange. According to this, that registration number wasn't issued until a month before the auction, but Apollo was already 3 years old when I bought him. A knock at the door interrupted their investigation. Sarah Reynolds, the vet, stood in the doorway holding a thick folder. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, placing the folder on Madison's desk. "I ran some additional tests on Apollo's blood work from yesterday. There's something interesting in his genetic markers." Madison opened the folder, her eyes scanning the complex medical data. "What am I looking at?" "These genetic markers," Sarah pointed to a specific section. "They're inconsistent with the bloodline listed in his auction papers. It's subtle, wouldn't be noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it, but it's there." The implications of this discovery hung heavy in the air. If Apollo's documented bloodline was incorrect, what else about his past might be false? As if in answer to that unspoken question, Madison's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check your front gate. R.C." Madison rushed outside, Thomas and Sarah following close behind. There, tucked into the gate's ironwork, was an envelope. Inside, she found a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photo showed a younger version of Apollo, his coat dull and his frame much thinner, standing in a simple paddock. The note read, "The truth about Apollo begins at Sanctuary Ridge. If you want answers, meet me tomorrow at the Blue Horse Cafe, 2 p.m. Come alone. Ryan Carter." "Ryan Carter?" Thomas frowned. Should we tell the police?" Madison studied the photograph, noting details that seemed to conflict with everything she knew about Apollo's supposed prestigious upbringing. "No," she decided. "Not yet. Whoever this Ryan Carter is, he knows something about Apollo's past, something that might explain what happened today." Back in her office, Madison spread everything out on her desk. The auction papers, the blood work results, the mysterious photograph. Each piece suggested a different story than the one she'd believed for the past 3 years. "Sarah," she asked, turning to the vet, "in your professional opinion, could Apollo's unusual behavior lately, could it be connected to memories, to his past?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Horses have remarkable emotional memory, especially regarding trauma or strong bonds. If Apollo had a significant relationship with someone before you owned him. "Like that woman today," Thomas interjected. "Exactly," Sarah nodded. "It could explain his recent behavior and his reaction to seeing her." Madison picked up the mysterious photograph again, studying it more closely. In the background, partially visible, was a sign with the words "Ridge," barely legible. Everything about the image suggested a very different life than the one detailed in Apollo's auction papers. "I need you both to keep this quiet for now," Madison said finally. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting this Ryan Carter. Maybe he can help us understand what we're dealing with." As night settled over the farm, Madison stood at the window of her office, looking out over the empty paddock where Apollo usually grazed. The events of the day had shaken everything she thought she knew about her beloved horse. But more than that, they had awakened questions she couldn't ignore about Apollo's true past, about the mysterious woman who seemed to share such a deep connection with him, and about what really happened during those missing months in his history. The photograph on her desk seemed to hold countless untold stories, and tomorrow's meeting with Ryan Carter might begin to unveil them. As she prepared to leave for the night, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a revelation that would change not just her understanding of Apollo, but her entire perspective on what it means to truly know and love an animal. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "They're safe. Truth takes courage to face. Be ready." The cryptic words sent a shiver down her spine, but also strengthened her resolve. Whatever secrets Apollo's past held, whatever truth awaited her at tomorrow's meeting, Madison was determined to understand it all, not just for her sake, but for Apollo's. The Blue Horse Cafe sat on a quiet corner of downtown Lexington, its weathered blue awning fluttering gently in the spring breeze. Madison arrived early, choosing a secluded booth near the back where she could observe the entrance. Her fingers traced the edges of the mysterious photograph she'd received, her mind still processing the revelations of the previous day's investigation. At exactly 2 p.m., a man entered the cafe. He was in his early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency before settling on Madison. Without hesitation, he walked to her booth and sat down. "Ryan Carter," he introduced himself, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for coming alone." Madison studied him carefully. "You seem to know a lot about Apollo and about me." Ryan's expression softened slightly. "I know more than you might expect, Miss Gunn Harper. But before we begin, I need to know something." He leaned forward, his eyes intent. "What matters more to you, Apollo's racing career or his well-being?" The question caught Madison off guard, but her answer came without hesitation. "His well-being." "Always." Ryan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good, because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about your horse." He pulled out a worn leather portfolio and placed it on the table. "Apollo's real story begins at Sanctuary Ridge, a horse rescue facility in Tennessee. And the woman you saw yesterday, that's Emma Calloway. She saved Apollo's life." Madison's heart skipped a beat as Ryan opened the portfolio, revealing more photographs. The first showed Apollo in a dire state, emaciated, his coat dull, his eyes lacking the spark she knew so well. "This was Apollo 3.5 years ago," Ryan explained. "He was rescued from a situation of severe neglect. Emma was the one who found him." The next photograph showed Emma, younger but unmistakable, sitting beside Apollo in a small paddock. The horse's head rested in her lap, and the trust between them was palpable even in the frozen image. "Emma has a gift," Ryan continued. "She can connect with horses that others have given up on. She spent months working with Apollo, healing not just his body, but his spirit. They developed a bond that—" He paused, searching for words. "Well, you saw it yourself yesterday." Madison's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. "But the auction papers, his registration—" "Fabricated," Ryan said flatly. "After Apollo recovered, he showed extraordinary natural talent. Word got around and certain people saw an opportunity. They created a false pedigree, complete with forged documentation. Emma fought against it, but the sanctuary was struggling financially. The offer was substantial." The implications of this revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. "So, when I bought him at auction—" "You bought a lie," Ryan finished gently. "Not about Apollo's abilities, those are very real, but about his past, his identity." He pulled out another document, this one showing a different registration number. "This is Apollo's original rescue documentation. His real name was Spirit." Madison's hands trembled slightly as she examined the paper. "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't Emma come forward sooner?" Ryan's expression grew serious. "Emma tried to track Apollo after the sale, but the auction house buried the paper trail. It wasn't until she saw him featured in racing magazines that she finally found him. She spent the last few months trying to figure out how to approach you, how to explain. But when she saw him at the Derby—" He spread his hands. "Well, you saw what happened." A waitress approached their table, but Madison barely registered her presence. Her mind was filled with images of Apollo, every quirk, every behavior she'd noticed over the years, suddenly taking on new meaning. "The sanctuary," she said finally. "Is it still operating?" Ryan nodded. "Barely. Emma and her family struggled to keep it going, but they never stopped trying. They've saved hundreds of horses over the years." Madison sat back, processing everything she'd learned. "Where are they now, Emma and Apollo?" "Safe," Ryan assured her. "Emma would never harm him, but she believes he remembers his time at the sanctuary, remembers being healed there. She couldn't bear the thought of him being pushed too hard in racing, risking injury." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The cafe had grown quieter, the afternoon lull setting in. Through the window, Madison could see the spires of Keeneland racetrack in the distance, a symbol of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd believed in. But now those dreams seemed hollow compared to the weight of Apollo's true story. "There's more you need to know," Ryan said, pulling out one final photograph. This one showed Apollo, spirit, in a large pasture, surrounded by other horses. He looked different there, relaxed, natural, free. The sanctuary isn't just a place where horses heal. It's a place where they can be themselves, without the pressures of racing or showing. Emma believes that's what Apollo was trying to tell you through his behavior, that he remembered that freedom. Madison studied the photograph, noting the peaceful expression on Apollo's face. It was a look she'd rarely seen during their time together, despite all her efforts to provide the best care possible. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Ryan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper. "That's up to you. But if you want to really understand what Apollo means to Emma, and what the sanctuary meant to him, this is the address. Whatever you decide to do, you deserve to see the whole truth for yourself." As Ryan stood to leave, he paused, looking down at Madison with genuine sympathy. "For what it's worth, Emma speaks highly of you. She's seen how you care for Apollo, how you listen to him. That's why she hopes you'll understand. Once you see everything." Madison remained at the booth long after Ryan had gone, the address clutched in her hand. Her world shifted irreversibly on its axis. The truth about Apollo, about spirit, was both simpler and more complex than she could have imagined. And somewhere in Tennessee, at a place called Sanctuary Ridge, more answers awaited. The drive to Tennessee stretched before Madison like an endless ribbon of asphalt, each mile marker bringing her closer to a truth she both craved and feared. She had left Highland Meadows at dawn, leaving Thomas in charge and telling only Sarah Reynolds where she was really going. The vet's final words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes loving something means being willing to question everything you thought you knew about it." The address Ryan had given her led to a remote area in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. As she turned off the main highway onto a narrow country road, the landscape began to change. Manicured horse farms gave way to wilder terrain, the perfectly maintained fences of Kentucky replaced by weathered wooden posts and simple wire. A wooden sign, weather-beaten but lovingly maintained, marked the entrance to Sanctuary Ridge. The words, "Where Healing Begins," were carved beneath the main title. And Madison felt something catch in her throat as she turned onto the gravel driveway. The facility was nothing like the pristine stables of Highland Meadows. The buildings were simple but well-maintained, the paddocks sprawling and natural. Horses of all types grazed freely in the pastures, some bearing visible signs of past hardship, others looking healthy and restored. The whole place had an air of peace that Madison hadn't expected. As she parked her truck, a familiar figure emerged from the main barn, Emma Calloway. In person, without the chaos of the derby surrounding them, she looked younger than Madison had imagined. She wore worn jeans and a faded work shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. But it was her eyes that caught Madison's attention. They held the same quiet intensity she'd seen in the photographs. "I've been expecting you," Emma said simply, walking forward to meet her. "Ryan told me you might come." Madison stepped out of her truck, emotions warring inside her. "Where is he?" Emma gestured toward a distant pasture. "He's where he always liked to be, by the old oak tree. Would you like to see him?" They walked in silence through the sanctuary, passing paddocks where horses turned to watch them with curious eyes. Madison noticed that each enclosure was designed to provide natural enrichment: fallen logs, small pools, varying terrain. It was as far from a traditional racing stable as one could imagine. As they crested a small hill, Madison saw him. Apollo, spirit, stood in the shade of a massive oak tree, his coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Another horse, a dappled grey, grazed nearby, and Madison was struck by how relaxed he appeared, how different from his usual alert racing stance. "That's Grace," Emma said softly, noting Madison's gaze on the grey horse. She was here when we first rescued him. They've always been close." Apollo lifted his head as they approached, and Madison felt tears spring to her eyes at his reaction. He nickered softly, moving forward to greet them both, showing no preference between the two women who had shaped such different chapters of his life. "He remembers you," Madison whispered, watching as Apollo gently nuzzled Emma's shoulder, the same gesture he had always shared with her. "He remembers everything," Emma replied. "Horses don't forget their past, Madison. They carry it with them, just like we do." She turned to face Madison fully. "I know you have questions. You deserve answers." They settled on a wooden bench near the pasture fence, Apollo grazing peacefully within view. Emma pulled a worn journal from her back pocket. "This is where I kept his recovery records. Every day, every small victory, every setback. Would you like to see?" Madison nodded, and Emma began to share the story she had carried for so long. She spoke of finding Apollo, then Spirit, in a ramshackle barn, barely alive but still fighting. She described the months of gentle rehabilitation, the breakthrough moments when his trust began to return, the first time he ran freely in the sanctuary's fields. "We never intended to lie to anyone," Emma explained, her voice thick with emotion. "But when word got out about his speed, his natural talent, the sanctuary was struggling. We needed funds for emergency medical equipment, for feed, for basic repairs." She closed her eyes briefly. "When they offered to create a new identity for him, to place him in the racing world, I fought against it, but I was outvoted. The sanctuary needed the money to survive, to help other horses." Madison listened, her heart heavy with understanding. "Why didn't you try to contact me sooner?" "I did," Emma admitted. "I sent letters to Highland Meadows, but they were probably filtered out as fan mail. I tried to arrange meetings at races, but security was always too tight. When I finally saw him at the Derby, watching the crowds, searching," she paused, "I knew he was looking for me. I couldn't let him down again." "So you took him," Madison said, but there was no accusation in her voice. "I know it was wrong," Emma acknowledged, "but seeing him there, sensing his anxiety, I just reacted. I couldn't bear the thought of him being pushed too hard, risking injury in a race he didn't choose to run." Madison watched as Apollo moved across the pasture with fluid grace, his movements natural and unrestrained. "He's different here," she observed. "This is where he healed," Emma explained, "where he learned to trust again, to be himself rather than what others wanted him to be." She turned to Madison, her expression earnest. "I've seen how you care for him, how you've tried to understand him. That's why I hope you'll understand why this place means so much to him." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pasture as the two women sat in contemplative silence, watching Apollo interact with the other horses. Madison felt her perspective shifting, her understanding of success and happiness reforming into something new and unexpected. "Show me," she said finally. "Show me everything. I want to understand, not just Apollo's past, but what this place is, what you do here. I need to see it all." Emma nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Come on, there's so much more to share." As they stood, Apollo lifted his head to watch them, his eyes holding a wisdom that Madison was only now beginning to comprehend. This was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about horses, about success, and about the true meaning of care and connection. As the evening approached at Sanctuary Ridge, Emma led Madison through the heart of the facility, each step revealing a new layer of understanding. The main barn was nothing like the climate-controlled stables of Highland Meadows, but it radiated a different kind of warmth, one born of genuine care and healing. "This is our medical center," Emma explained, leading Madison into a converted stable area. Inside, several horses were receiving various forms of treatment. A young Palomino stood patiently, while a volunteer changed his bandages, while across the aisle, an older mare received gentle physical therapy for a healing leg. "Most of our residents come to us with severe physical or emotional trauma," Emma continued, pausing beside a gentle-eyed thoroughbred. "This is Starlight. She was rescued from the same situation as Apollo." Madison approached the mare carefully, noting the faded scars along her flanks. "What happened to them?" Emma's expression darkened. "They were part of a private racing operation. The owner, he pushed them too hard, too fast. When they couldn't perform to his standards, he simply stopped caring for them." She stroked Starlight's neck gently. "Apollo was actually one of the lucky ones. His spirit never broke, even in the worst conditions. As they moved through the facility, Madison began to see patterns in the way the sanctuary operated. Everything was designed around the horses, natural behaviors and healing processes. There were no rigid training schedules, no forced exercises. Instead, horses moved freely between spaces, designed for different types of natural enrichment. "This is our rehabilitation paddock," Emma said, leading Madison to a large, naturally contoured space. "We let them choose their own pace here. Some take days to venture out, others months." Apollo, she smiled at the memory, he was different. Even in his weakened state, he had this incredible presence, this will to live. They paused at a small office, where Emma retrieved a thick file. "These are his recovery photos. Are you sure you want to see them?" Madison nodded, though her heart clenched at the first images. They showed Apollo, spirit then, when he first arrived at the sanctuary. His ribs were clearly visible, his once proud neck thin and weak. But even in those desperate images, his eyes held that familiar spark of intelligence. "How?" Madison's voice caught. "How could anyone let this happen?" "The racing world can be brutal," Emma said softly. "Not everyone is like you, Madison. Some see horses only as investments, as machines to be pushed until they break." She turned to a later section of the file. "But look at this." The newer photos showed Apollo's gradual transformation. Week by week, his body healed, his coat regained its shine. But it was the series of photos showing him with Emma that truly caught Madison's attention. In each image, their connection was palpable, a partnership built on trust and genuine understanding. "He was never meant to be just a racing horse," Emma explained, leading Madison back outside where the setting sun painted the hills in gold. "His speed, his grace, those are gifts he chooses to share, not talents to be exploited." They walked to the oak tree where Apollo still grazed peacefully. He lifted his head as they approached, moving to greet them with equal affection. Madison watched as he interacted with Emma, seeing now what she had missed before: the absolute trust, the deep understanding between them. "Your facility at Highland Meadows," Emma said carefully. "It's beautiful, state-of-the-art. But have you ever wondered if that's what the horses really need?" Madison considered the question, thinking back to Apollo's recent behavior. "I always thought I was giving him the best care possible." "You were," Emma assured her. "But sometimes the best care isn't about the finest equipment or the most expensive training programs. Sometimes it's about letting them be who they really are." As if to emphasize her point, Apollo suddenly broke into a spontaneous run across the pasture, his movement completely natural and free. There was no jockey guiding him, no prescribed track to follow, yet his grace was undeniable. Other horses joined him, and Madison watched in amazement as they moved together in a dance of pure joy. "This is who he is," Emma said softly. "A leader, a healer in his own right. The other horses look up to him, draw strength from his presence. At the Derby, he wasn't just responding to me, he was trying to tell you something too." Madison sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the implications of everything she was learning. "All this time, I thought I was helping him reach his potential, but maybe I was just—" "You gave him love," Emma interrupted gently, "a real love. That's why he trusted you, why he tried so hard for you. But love sometimes means being willing to see beyond our own dreams for those we care about." As darkness began to fall, lights came on around the sanctuary, casting a soft glow over the peaceful scene. In the distance, Apollo had settled back under his favorite oak tree, surrounded by his companions. The sight stirred something deep in Madison's heart, a recognition of a truth she had somehow always known, but never fully acknowledged. "Now there's something else you need to see," Emma said, noticing Madison's thoughtful expression, "something that might help you understand why this place means so much to him, and to all of us." Madison stood, ready to follow. She had come seeking answers about Apollo's past, but she was finding something far more profound, a new understanding of what it truly means to care for these magnificent creatures, and perhaps a new purpose for her own future in the horse world. The morning light had barely touched the hills of Sanctuary Ridge when Madison's phone erupted with urgent messages. Thomas's voicemail was particularly disturbing. "Madison, "We've got trouble. The racing board is investigating Apollo's records. Someone leaked information about his past. The press is all over this. Call me back immediately." She stood at the window of the small guest cottage where Emma had offered her lodging for the night, watching as the sanctuary came to life. In the distance, she could see Apollo greeting the dawn with his new herd, looking more at peace than she'd ever seen him at Highland Meadows. "Bad news?" Emma's voice came from the cottage doorway. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, offering one to Madison. "The racing board found out," Madison replied, accepting the coffee gratefully, "about Apollo's true history. It's only a matter of time before the media picks up the full story." Emma's expression tightened. "I was afraid this might happen. When we took him from the derby, it was bound to raise questions." Before they could discuss it further, a truck came speeding up the sanctuary's drive, kicking up gravel in its wake. Ryan Carter emerged, his usually calm demeanor visibly shaken. "We've got problems," he announced, striding toward them. "The previous owner, the one who neglected Apollo and the others, he's making noise, claims he has proof that the sanctuary illegally seized his horses." Emma's face paled. "That's impossible. We had all the proper documentation, the police reports." "He's saying they were falsified," Ryan continued. "He's threatening legal action against the sanctuary. And Madison." He turned to her apologetically. "He's claiming you were part of a conspiracy to steal and fraudulently register his horse." Madison felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Everything she'd built at Highland Meadows, her reputation, her credibility, could be destroyed if these allegations gained traction. "His name is Victor Durham," Emma said quietly, her hands gripping her coffee mug tightly. "He used to be a big name in racing circles before his methods were exposed, but he still has connections. Powerful friends." "Show me everything," Madison demanded. "All the documentation from Apollo's rescue. If we're going to fight this, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." They gathered in the sanctuary's modest office, where Emma pulled out a thick file of legal documents, photographs, and veterinary reports. The evidence of Apollo's neglect was overwhelming, but Madison noticed something troubling. These dates, she pointed to several key documents. They don't match the timeline in the auction papers." "Because those were falsified," Emma admitted. "Not by us, by the people who helped create Apollo's new identity for the racing world. They thought they were helping, giving him a chance at a better life, but they gave Durham a weapon to use against us," Ryan finished grimly. A crack of thunder rolled across the hills, and rain began to patter against the office windows. Madison watched as the horses in the nearby paddock sought shelter, all except Apollo, who remained under his oak tree, seemingly unbothered by the weather. "There's more," Ryan said hesitantly. "Durham isn't just threatening legal action. He's demanding Apollo's return, claims he never legally surrendered ownership." The implications of this hit Madison like a physical blow. If Durham's claims held any legal weight, Apollo could be forced to return to the man who had nearly destroyed him. Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "That will never happen. I won't let him hurt these horses again." "We need to think strategically," Madison said, her business instincts kicking in. "Durham's real goal isn't Apollo, it's money. He sees an opportunity for profit, either through legal settlements or blackmail," Ryan concluded. "He knows the scandal could damage both Highland Meadows and the sanctuary." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof as they considered their options. Through the window, Madison could see volunteers rushing to secure the facility against the approaching storm, their dedication evident in every action. "The sanctuary's financial records," Madison said suddenly, "from when Apollo was sold. We need to track exactly where that money went." Emma nodded, pulling out more files. Every penny was documented. Most of it went to medical equipment, emergency care for other rescues. As they pored over the records, Madison began to see the bigger picture. The sanctuary had saved dozens of horses with the money from Apollo's sale, each case meticulously documented, but those very records could now be used against them, proving they had profited from the sale of a horse whose ownership was in dispute. "So I assume, what about the other horses?" Madison asked. "The ones rescued with Apollo?" "Starlight is still here," Emma replied, "and 3 others. They're our living proof of what Durham did." thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the power flickered ominously. Madison moved to the window, watching as Apollo finally sought shelter in the barn. Even in the growing storm, his movements showed a confidence and peace that stood in stark contrast to the chaos brewing around him. "We can't let Durham win," Madison said firmly, "not just for Apollo's sake, but for every horse in this sanctuary." She turned to face Emma and Ryan. "I have resources, connections in the racing world. If we work together—" "It's not that simple," Emma interrupted. "Durham knows people too. Powerful people who've helped cover up his actions for years. And now he's threatening to expose everyone involved in Apollo's new identity, including some of the sanctuary's biggest donors." The gravity of the situation settled over them as the storm raged outside. They weren't just fighting for Apollo anymore. They were fighting for the survival of everything the sanctuary represented. And somewhere out there, Victor Durham was preparing to destroy it all, using the very system they had tried to work within against them. As lightning illuminated the darkness, Madison caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, overlaid against the image of the sanctuary beyond. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about choosing between two worlds anymore. It was about finding the courage to change the system itself, no matter the personal cost. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered across Sanctuary Ridge. Fallen branches littered the paddocks, and volunteers worked tirelessly to repair minor damage to the fences. Madison stood in the main barn's office, surrounded by papers and photographs, piecing together the complex puzzle of Apollo's past. "I found something," she announced to Emma and Ryan, who were reviewing legal documents nearby. "Look at these photographs from Durham's old training facility." She spread several images across the desk. "See this mark on Apollo's shoulder? It's barely visible now, but it matches perfectly with the one in his rescue photos." Emma leaned in, studying the images intently. "That's not just any mark. It's a freeze brand, Durham's way of marking his property. We documented dozens of horses with similar marks during the investigation." "But here's what's interesting," Madison continued, pulling out more recent photographs. "In all of Apollo's racing documentation, this mark is completely absent from the registration photos." "Someone digitally removed it." Ryan's expression darkened. "Durham's not just after money, he's trying to protect himself. If Apollo's true identity becomes public knowledge, it would reopen the entire investigation," Emma finished. "Not just into Apollo's case, but all the horses that passed through his facility." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the office window, they could see a sleek black car pulling up the muddy drive. A woman in an impeccable business suit emerged, her presence seeming oddly out of place in the rustic sanctuary setting. "That's Catherine Walsh," Ryan said grimly, "Durham's attorney." Madison straightened her shoulders, years of dealing with racing officials evident in her posture. "Let me handle this. I speak their language." As they stepped out to meet the attorney, Madison noticed Apollo watching intently from his paddock, his ears forward and alert. Even at a distance, his presence seemed to radiate strength. "Miss Harper," Catherine Walsh greeted her with professional coolness. "I'm surprised to find you here, though perhaps I shouldn't be, given the circumstances." "Ms. Walsh," Madison replied evenly, "I assume you're here about Mr. Durham's claims." "Claims that have substantial merit," Walsh responded, opening her briefcase. "I have here documentation proving Mr. Durham's original ownership of the horse known as Apollo, as well as evidence of improper seizure and fraudulent registration." Emma stepped forward, her voice firm despite her obvious tension. "We have documentation too, evidence of systematic abuse, veterinary reports, police statements, potentially inadmissible evidence," Walsh cut in smoothly, "gathered under questionable circumstances. Mr. Durham is prepared to be reasonable. However," she turned to Madison, "he's willing to keep this matter private, avoid any public scandal, in exchange for appropriate compensation and the return of his property." "Property?" Madison's voice carried a sharp edge. "Apollo is a living being who nearly died under your client's care. We have proof." "Proof that was never tested in court," Walsh countered. "My client maintains that any issues with the horse's care were due to circumstances beyond his control. Former employees acting without authorization, inadequate veterinary support in a rural area. She smiled thinly. All very defensible positions. As they argued, a truck pulled into the sanctuary. An elderly man stepped out, moving slowly but purposefully toward the group. Emma gasped softly. "Dr. Harrison," she breathed. "I haven't seen him since the night we rescued Apollo," the old veterinarian finished, joining them. "Mrs. Walsh, I've been expecting you'd show up eventually. That's why I brought these." He patted a worn leather satchel. "Original copies of all my examinations and reports, with full documentation of the condition of every horse in Durham's facility, including..." He pulled out a thick envelope. Detailed photographs of the freeze branding process Durham used to mark his horses. Photographs that show him personally administering the marks. Walsh's composed expression flickered slightly. "Dr. Harrison, my client has already addressed the issue of unauthorized employee actions." "I wasn't an employee," Harrison interrupted. "I was the county veterinary inspector. Every visit, every examination, every photograph was part of an official investigation. An investigation that was mysteriously halted before it could be completed." Madison watched the interaction carefully, noting the subtle shift in Walsh's demeanor. "It seems, Ms. Walsh, that there's more to this story than your client has shared with you." Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm approaching. In the paddock, Apollo had moved closer to the fence, his presence somehow adding weight to the confrontation unfolding before him. "There are more of us," Harrison continued. "Former employees, other veterinarians, feed suppliers, all with stories to tell. Stories we kept quiet because we were afraid of Durham's influence, but not anymore." Walsh closed her briefcase with a sharp click. "I'll need to consult with my client regarding this new information. Tell Durham something for me," Madison said as Walsh turned to leave. "I tell him I understand now why Apollo always watched the crowd so carefully. He wasn't just looking for Emma. He was watching for someone else too, someone he feared might return." After Walsh's car disappeared down the drive, Harrison turned to the group. "There's more," he said quietly. "Much more. Things about Durham's operation that never made it into the official reports. Things that might explain why he's so desperate to silence this story." As the first drops of rain began to fall, they retreated to the barn office. Madison looked at Apollo one last time before going inside, seeing him now not just as a champion racer or a rescued horse, but as a key to exposing a truth that had remained hidden for too long. Harrison settled into a chair, his old veterinarian's bag heavy with secrets waiting to be revealed. "You might want to sit down," he said, pulling out a weathered notebook. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about Durham, about Apollo, and about the world of horse racing itself." Rain drummed steadily against the barn's metal roof as Dr. Harrison spread his documents across the office desk. The yellow pages of his old notebook carried the weight of years of careful observation and silent witness. Madison, Emma, and Ryan gathered close, while outside the horses sought shelter from the strengthening storm. Durham's operation wasn't just about racing, Harrison began, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he opened his notebook. It was about creating an illusion of pedigree. He didn't just abuse horses, he erased their histories, created false bloodlines, and sold them as purebred champions. He pulled out a series of photographs, laying them in sequence. This was Apollo's spirit then, when he first arrived at Durham's facility. Notice the distinctive marking on his left hind leg. Now look at these registration papers from 6 months later. Madison leaned forward, studying the documents. The marking is gone. Not just covered. The horse in these papers has completely different markings. Exactly, Harrison nodded. Durham wasn't just falsifying papers. He was running a sophisticated operation that involved making horses disappear and reappear as different animals entirely. The abuse we documented was just the surface. The real crime was identity fraud on a massive scale. Emma's hand found Apollo's original rescue documentation. But why? Purebred horses are valuable, but surely the risk... It wasn't just about money, Harrison interrupted. Durham was creating perfect racing histories. Horses with impeccable bloodlines, guaranteed to attract investors. The animals that couldn't be transformed, couldn't be made to fit the false narratives he created. Those were the ones we found in those terrible conditions. Thunder crashed outside, and the barn's lights flickered. Through the window, Madison could see Apollo in his shelter, standing protective watch over several younger horses who had sought refuge with him. Apollo was different, Harrison continued, pulling out more photographs. Durham's usual methods didn't work on him. No matter how much they tried to break his spirit, he maintained this presence, this inherent nobility that couldn't be erased. That's why they pushed him so hard. They needed him to either conform or be discarded. Madison finished quietly, understanding now why Apollo had always seemed different from other racing horses. His spirit hadn't just survived, it had triumphed over attempts to remake him into something he wasn't. Ryan, who had been quietly studying the documents, suddenly straightened. These dates, they coincide with major investments in Durham's operation. Look at the pattern. Every time he sold a transformed horse, new money would flow in from racing syndicates, breeding programs, creating a perfect circle of fraud. Harrison nodded. Just the transformed horses would win enough races to validate their false pedigrees, attracting more investors, allowing Durham to acquire more horses to transform. But Apollo, he threatened to expose everything. Because he couldn't be transformed, Emma said softly. Because his true nature always showed through. Madison stood, moving to the window to watch Apollo in the storm. That's why Durham wants him back so badly. Apollo isn't just evidence of abuse, he's proof of the entire fraudulent operation. And he's not alone, Harrison added, pulling out one final document. I've kept records of every horse that passed through Durham's hands. Some were sold to racing stables across the country, others to breeding programs, each one carrying papers that tell a false story. The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just about saving one horse or protecting one sanctuary anymore. It was about exposing a system that had allowed such fraud to flourish. We can't fight this through normal legal channels, Ryan said, voicing what they were all thinking. Durham has too many connections, too much influence in the racing world. No, Madison agreed, turning back to the group. But we can fight it with the truth, not just Apollo's truth, but the truth about every horse that passed through Durham's hands, every false pedigree, every transformed identity. Emma stood to join her at the window. How? The racing authorities won't be able to ignore evidence from multiple sources, Madison finished. Dr. Harrison's records, combined with the sanctuary's documentation, plus, she paused, an idea forming, plus the testimony of every owner who unknowingly bought one of Durham's transformed horses. It would shake the entire racing industry, Ryan warned. Maybe it needs to be shaken, Madison replied firmly. Maybe this isn't just about saving Apollo or the sanctuary. Maybe it's about changing a system that allowed someone like Durham to operate for so long. Harrison nodded slowly, beginning to gather his documents. I can contact other veterinarians who worked with Durham's horses. Many of them have stayed silent out of fear. But if we move together, we'll need more than just testimony, Emma added, her eyes lighting up with determination. We need to prove the connection between each transformed horse and their original identity, show the pattern of fraud. And we need to move fast, Ryan interjected, before Durham realizes what we're planning. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder growing more distant. Apollo had left his shelter and was standing in the light rain, his head held high, watching the clearing sky. Madison felt something shift inside her as she watched him, a certainty that transcended her previous understanding of success and purpose. First thing tomorrow, she said, turning back to the group, we start gathering evidence, every record, every photograph, every witness willing to speak. Durham thinks he can use the system to silence us. Instead, we'll use the truth to change the system itself. As if in response to her words, Apollo's distinctive neigh carried through the rain-washed air, a sound of strength, of defiance, of unbroken spirit. In that moment, Madison understood that they weren't just fighting for one horse's freedom or one sanctuary's survival. They were fighting for something much bigger, the right of every horse to be true to its own nature, free from the artificial constraints of human greed and ambition. The next few days at Sanctuary Ridge transformed the peaceful horse haven into a center of intense activity. Madison had converted the small office into a command center, walls now covered with photographs, documents, and connecting threads that mapped out Durham's extensive network of fraud. "Another one just confirmed," Ryan announced, hanging up his phone. "A stable in Virginia. Their prize stallion's papers match perfectly with one of the horses from Harrison's records. Different markings, same distinctive gait pattern and behavioral traits." Madison added another pin to their growing map. "That makes 7 confirmed cases in 3 days. How many owners are willing to go public?" "5 so far," Emma replied, sorting through a stack of emails. "The other 2 are scared. Durham's influence runs deep in Virginia's racing circuit." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the window, they watched as 3 more cars pulled into the sanctuary's parking area. Former employees from Durham's facility, coming forward with their own stories after hearing about the investigation. "Miss Harper," a young volunteer appeared at the door. "Dr. Reynolds is here from Kentucky. She says she has Apollo's original blood work from Highland Meadows." Madison nodded. "Send her in. Those genetic markers she found might be the key to proving the identity switches." As Sarah Reynolds entered, carrying her medical files, Madison couldn't help but notice how the veterinarian's eyes widened at their wall of evidence. "This is bigger than I imagined." "Bigger than any of us imagined," Madison agreed. "Your blood work might help us prove it's systematic, not just isolated cases." They were deep in discussion over genetic markers when Emma's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face paled as she read it. "The State Racing Board," she said quietly. "They're suspending all licenses connected to horses with suspected altered documentation, including Apollo's." Madison felt her stomach drop. "That means Highland Meadows will be barred from all upcoming races until this is resolved," Ryan finished grimly. "Durham's making his move. He's using his connections to pressure everyone involved." Outside, Apollo grazed peacefully in his favorite spot under the oak tree. Unaware of the storm brewing around him, Madison watched him through the window, remembering the prestigious races, the victories, the dreams she'd held for his future. Now all of that seemed somehow less important than the simple dignity she saw in him here. "There's more," Emma continued, scrolling through her phone. "The sanctuary's main donors are being audited. Someone's trying to trace every dollar connected to rescued horses." "They're trying to strangle us financially," Ryan observed. "Force us to back down before we can expose everything." Madison turned from the window, her expression hardening with determination. "So then we go public now, before they can silence everyone." "It's risky," Sarah warned, "without all the evidence properly documented." "We have enough," Madison insisted. "Harrison's records, the blood work, 7 confirmed cases of identity fraud. More importantly, we have living proof." She gestured toward Apollo. "Every horse here tells part of the story." A commotion from the main paddock interrupted their discussion. One of the volunteers rushed in. "Out of breath. You need to see this. All the local news stations. They're running a story about the sanctuary." They hurried to the small break room where a television played in the corner. The news anchor's voice filled the space. "Breaking news in the world of horse racing. Questions arise about the legitimacy of rescue claims at prominent horse sanctuary. Sources suggest possible involvement in horse theft and fraudulent sales." Emma sank into a chair, her face ashen. "They're trying to discredit us before we can tell the truth." "Not just discredit," Ryan added, checking his phone. "Durham's lawyers are filing for an emergency injunction. They want to seize all the sanctuary's records and place the horses under protective custody pending investigation." Madison felt the weight of every dream, every hope, every carefully laid plan pressing down on her. But when she looked out at Apollo, still standing proud despite everything, she found her resolve strengthening. "Call everyone," she said firmly. "Every owner who's confirmed their horse's true identity, every former employee willing to speak, every veterinarian with records. Tell them to meet us here tomorrow morning." "Madison," Emma started, concern evident in her voice. "If we move too fast, we're out of time for caution," Madison interrupted. "Durham's trying to bury the truth under legal machinery and public doubt. We need to show people the real story, not just tell them about it." She moved to the evidence wall, studying the complex web they'd uncovered. Each of these horses has a true identity, a real story. Tomorrow, we start telling those stories, all of them. Sarah stepped forward, medical files clutched to her chest. I'll contact my colleagues in other practices. Many of them have treated Durham's horses over the years. They might have their own documentation. Good, Madison nodded. Ryan, reach out to every racing journal, every equestrian magazine. Emma, contact animal welfare organizations. It's time to show the world what's really been happening in the racing industry. As the group dispersed to begin their tasks, Madison remained in the office. Adding one final photograph to their wall, Apollo's original rescue photo next to his racing registration image. The contrast was stark, telling a story of transformation that went far deeper than changed markings or falsified papers. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm approaching. But this time it wasn't just weather they were facing. It was the storm of truth breaking over a system built on carefully constructed lies. Madison watched as Apollo gathered his herd under the oak tree, providing shelter and leadership as he had done so many times before. "You never forgot who you really were," she whispered to his distant figure. "Now it's time for everyone else to remember too." Dawn broke over Sanctuary Ridge to find the facility transformed into an impromptu media center. Horse trailers and news vans filled the parking area, while owners who had traveled through the night gathered in small groups, sharing stories of horses whose true identities had been hidden for years. Madison stood on the small rise overlooking the main paddock, watching as Emma and Dr. Harrison prepared for what would be the most important presentation of their lives. They had arranged the rescued horses, including Apollo, in a way that would allow easy comparison with their racing documentation photos. The first news crews are ready," Ryan reported, joining her on the hill. "We've got representatives from every major racing publication, 3 national networks, and dozens of local stations. And Durham's people, already trying to shut us down. His lawyers are on their way with an emergency injunction, but they're at least 2 hours out." Madison nodded, checking her watch. "Then we do this now, before they can stop us." The presentation began with Dr. Harrison's methodical exposition of the evidence. Using side-by-side comparisons projected onto a large screen, he showed how horses' markings had been altered, documents falsified, and identities erased. Each case built upon the last, creating an undeniable pattern of systematic fraud. Then came the owners, each stepping forward to tell their stories. A breeder from Virginia, fighting tears as she described discovering her prized mare's true origin. A racing stable manager from Florida, presenting documentation that proved his champion stallion's pedigree was entirely fabricated. "The genetic markers are unmistakable," Sarah Reynolds explained to the assembled crowd, pointing to her detailed analysis. "These aren't just similar horses. They're the same animals, their identities artificially altered to create the illusion of prestigious bloodlines." As the morning progressed, more evidence emerged. Former employees described the precise methods used to alter horses, appearances. Feed suppliers testified about irregular deliveries and hidden facilities. Each piece added depth to the picture of Durham's massive deception, but it was Emma's presentation that captured everyone's attention. She led Apollo into the center of the gathering, his presence commanding even in this simple setting. "This is Spirit," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Known to the racing world as Apollo. His journey from abuse to champion represents every horse that Durham tried to transform. But Apollo showed us something crucial, that a horse's true nature can't be erased or rewritten." The cameras flashed as Emma demonstrated how Apollo's distinctive markings had been concealed, how his original documentation had been buried. But more compelling was the horse's behavior itself, his quiet dignity, his clear bond with both Emma and Madison, his natural leadership of the other rescued horses. Just as Emma began to describe the sanctuary's rescue operation, a commotion erupted at the back of the crowd. Catherine Walsh had arrived, flanked by local law enforcement. "This presentation is in violation of a court order," Walsh announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. "We have an injunction requiring the immediate cessation of these proceedings and the surrender of all related documentation." Madison stepped forward, but before she could speak, another voice rang out from the crowd. I have something to add first. All heads turned to see an elegant older woman making her way to the front. Madison recognized her immediately. Victoria Durham, Victor's ex-wife and former partner in his racing operation. Victoria, Walsh started. My client has specifically instructed. Your client, Victoria interrupted, is my ex-husband, and he's about to learn that some truths can't stay buried forever. She turned to face the cameras. I was there when this all began. I watched Victor transform a respected racing stable into a fraud factory, and I have proof. From her bag, she withdrew a leather-bound ledger. Every transaction, every identity change, every falsified document, all recorded in Victor's own handwriting. I kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to him. The impact of Victoria's appearance was electric. Journalists surged forward, cameras flashed continuously, and Walsh stood frozen, her injunction papers forgotten in her hands. But the most dramatic reaction came from the horses themselves. As Victoria spoke, Apollo moved forward, approaching her with careful steps. Those watching fell silent as the horse gently pressed his nose against her hand, a gesture of recognition that brought tears to the woman's eyes. He remembers, she whispered, loud enough for the nearest microphones to catch. He was one of the first ones Victor tried to transform. I used to sneak him extra food, try to ease his suffering. That's when I started keeping records, knowing someday someone would need to know the truth. The morning's carefully planned presentation had just transformed into something far more powerful, a moment of raw truth that no legal injunction could stop. As Victoria began sharing details from her ledger, Madison noticed movement at the sanctuary's entrance. More horse trailers were arriving, and with them came familiar faces, owners and trainers from across the country, each bringing their own stories of Durham's deception. But with this surge of truth came a new danger. Madison's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Thomas back at Highland Meadows. Durham had been seen leaving his estate in a rage, heading toward Tennessee. He's coming, Madison warned Emma quietly. And he's not coming with lawyers this time. The truth was finally breaking free, but its price might be higher than any of them had imagined. As thunder rolled in the distance, another storm approaching. Madison realized that their moment of triumph might also be the beginning of their greatest challenge. The afternoon sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, matching the tension that now gripped Sanctuary Ridge. As Victoria Durham continued sharing decades of carefully documented fraud with the assembled media, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. But no one moved to seek shelter. The truth pouring forth was more compelling than any storm. Madison stood with Emma near Apollo's paddock, both women watching the sanctuary's entrance with growing apprehension. Ryan's network of contacts had tracked Durham's progress. He was less than 30 minutes away. We need to move the horses to the back pastures, Emma said, her voice tight with concern. Somewhere safe, out of sight. No, Madison replied, a plan forming in her mind. That's exactly what he'd expect. These horses have spent too long hiding. It's time they stood their ground. Victoria approached them, her elegant composure somewhat shaken after hours of testimony. I know Victor, she said quietly. When he arrives and he'll try to create chaos. It's always been his way. If he can't control the narrative, he'll destroy it. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching cut through the rain. Multiple engines, moving fast up the sanctuary's drive. The gathered media crews turned their cameras toward the entrance, sensing the coming confrontation. Durham's arrival was exactly as dramatic as his ex-wife had predicted. 3 black SUVs skidded to a halt in the muddy parking area, and Durham emerged from the first, his face contorted with rage. He was flanked by several men who looked more like enforcers than lawyers. This ends now, he shouted, striding toward the crowd. This whole sanctuary is nothing but a front for horse theft and fraud. I have proof that every rescue was illegal, every rehabilitation story fabricated. No, Victor. Victoria's voice cut through his tirade as she stepped forward. You've run out of lies to tell. Durham faltered for just a moment at the sight of his ex-wife, but quickly recovered. Victoria, still trying to destroy everything I've built. You destroyed it yourself, she replied calmly, holding up her ledger. Every crime, every falsified document, every horse you tried to transform, It's all here, in your own handwriting." The rain was falling harder now, but no one moved. The confrontation had drawn everyone into its gravity: journalists, owners, sanctuary volunteers, all watching as decades of deception finally faced the light of truth. Durham's laugh was harsh. "You think some old notebook can stand against my influence, my connections? I own half the racing boards in this country." "Not anymore," Madison stepped forward, her voice carrying across the gathering. "While you were driving here, every racing authority in the country was receiving certified copies of all our evidence. Your connections are scrambling to distance themselves as we speak." Something dangerous flashed in Durham's eyes. He gestured to his men, who began spreading out around the crowd. "Then I'll take back what's mine, starting with that horse." He pointed at Apollo, who stood calmly at the paddock fence, watching the confrontation with alert interest. "That's my property, and I'm leaving with him today." "He was never your property," Emma's voice rang out as she moved to stand beside Apollo. "He was a living being you tried to break and reshape, but you failed. He remembered who he was, spirit, not your creation, and now everyone knows the truth." Durham's face twisted with fury. He started forward, his men moving with him, but suddenly found his path blocked. The other rescued horses had begun moving up to the fence line, forming a living barrier beside Apollo. Among them was Starlight, the mare who had been rescued with him, and others who bore the faded marks of Durham's attempt to remake them. The sight stopped Durham in his tracks. These weren't the broken, fearful animals he had discarded. They stood proud, strong, their very presence a testament to the healing power of truth and compassion. Victoria moved to stand with Madison and Emma. "Look at them, Victor. Really look. Every horse here represents a life you tried to erase, a spirit you tried to break. But they survived. They remembered, and now they're telling their own story." The rain was sheeting down now, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing the moment as Durham's carefully constructed world crumbled around him. His men, sensing the shift in power, began backing away. "It's over," Madison said firmly. "The racing world knows the truth now. Every owner who bought one of your transformed horses has come forward. Every false pedigree has been exposed. You can either leave now or wait for the authorities who are already on their way." Durham's face went through a complex series of emotions: rage, disbelief, and finally, a kind of desperate resignation. He looked at Apollo one last time, but the horse met his gaze without fear, standing tall beside Emma and Madison. "You've destroyed everything," he spat, but his words lacked their former power. "No," Emma corrected him, "we've just set the truth free." As if in response to her words, Apollo let out a loud neigh that was quickly joined by the other horses, a chorus of victory, of liberation, of spirits unbroken despite all attempts to reshape them. Durham turned and walked back to his vehicle, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As his SUVs disappeared down the drive, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The storm continued to rage, but something had broken with Durham's departure, not just his power, but the hold that his system of lies had maintained over the racing world for so long. In the days following Durham's departure, Sanctuary Ridge transformed once again. What had begun as a simple horse rescue facility had become a symbol of change in the racing world. News crews continued to arrive daily, but now they came to document something different: the beginning of a revolution in how the industry viewed and treated its equine athletes. Madison sat in the sanctuary's office, surrounded by stacks of letters and emails from racing stables across the country. "Another one," she said, holding up a message. "The Burton stables in Kentucky. They want to partner with us. Create a retirement program for their horses." "That's the 5th major stable this week," Emma noted, sorting through her own correspondence. "And the support from donors has been overwhelming since the truth came out. We might actually be able to expand the sanctuary." Through the window, they could see Apollo in his favorite paddock, now joined by 3 new arrivals, former racing horses whose owners had recognized the importance of letting them simply be horses again. The sight brought a smile to Madison's face, remembering her own journey from seeing horses as investments to understanding them as beings deserving of choice and respect. "The state racing board called," Ryan announced, entering the office with fresh coffee for everyone. They want both of you to serve on their newly formed ethics committee. They're rewriting the rules about horse welfare and authentication. Durham's exposure has opened their eyes to how much needs to change. Victor Durham, who had become a regular presence at the sanctuary, looked up from her work, documenting the histories of Durham's former horses. It's more than just rule changes. The whole culture is shifting. People are starting to question the old ways of doing things. She was right. The racing world was experiencing a seismic shift in priorities. Stables were implementing new welfare protocols. Breeding programs were becoming more transparent, and a growing number of owners were embracing the idea that horses deserved lives beyond their racing careers. Highland Meadows called again, Thomas said, joining the group. The renovation plans are ready for your approval, Madison. Madison nodded, thinking of how her own facility was evolving. The prestigious racing stable was being transformed into a hybrid facility, still training horses for competition. But now with programs for rehabilitation and retirement as well. The changes had cost her some traditional clients, but had attracted others who shared her new vision. Speaking of changes, Emma said carefully, we should discuss Apollo's future. The room grew quiet. Apollo's story had become legendary in the weeks since Durham's exposure, with many arguing that he should return to racing to prove that rescued horses could compete at the highest levels. Others felt he had earned his retirement, deserving to live out his days in peace at the sanctuary. Madison stood and walked to the window, watching as Apollo led his small herd in their evening routine. I've been thinking about that, she said slowly. What if we let him choose? The others looked at her questioningly. We've spent so much time deciding what horses should do, who they should be, Madison continued. Maybe it's time we learn to listen to what they're telling us instead. Emma joined her at the window. What are you suggesting? A new program, Madison explained, turning to face the group. One that combines both our facilities, Highland Meadows and Sanctuary Ridge. We create a space where horses can show us what they want to do. Some might choose to race, others to simply be, but it would be their choice, not ours. The idea hung in the air. Revolutionary in its simplicity, Victoria was the first to respond. It could work, she said thoughtfully. We have enough documentation now to show how horses communicate their preferences if we're willing to pay attention. Apollo's been trying to tell us what he wanted all along. The media would love it, Ryan added. A whole new approach to horse care and training, growing out of this scandal. It could set a new standard for the industry. As they discussed the possibilities, a commotion from outside drew their attention. Apollo had left his paddock and was trotting toward the training area, where some of the younger horses were being exercised. They watched as he positioned himself alongside the fence, matching his pace to the horses in training, his movement fluid and natural. Look at that, Emma said softly. He's showing us. He doesn't want to just race or just retire. He wants to teach. Madison felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Apollo demonstrate proper form to the younger horses. His years of both racing and sanctuary life combining into something entirely new and valuable. Then that's what he'll do, she decided, and we'll build something new around his example. A place where horses can be athletes or teachers or simply themselves, whatever they choose to be. As the sun began to set over Sanctuary Ridge, casting long shadows across the grounds, the group continued planning their new venture. The scandal that had shaken the racing world was transforming into something unexpected, a chance to rebuild the relationship between humans and horses on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. Outside, Apollo had finished his impromptu training session and was leading his herd back to their favorite oak tree. His bearing was neither that of a racing champion nor a rescue horse, but something uniquely his own, a being who had maintained his true nature through every attempt to reshape him, and who was now helping to reshape the world around him instead. 1 year later, the combined flags of Highland Meadows and Sanctuary Ridge fluttered in the Kentucky breeze as crowds gathered for the inauguration of the Spirit Foundation. The new facility, stretching across rolling hills that connected Madison's original racing stable to a vast natural sanctuary, represented everything they had fought to achieve. Madison stood at the podium, looking out over the assembled guests, racing officials, stable owners, journalists, and most importantly, families who had come to witness a new chapter in the relationship between humans and horses. Behind her, the innovative facility showcased a perfect blend of traditional training areas and natural spaces designed to let horses choose their own paths. "A year ago," Madison began, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd, "I thought I knew everything about success in the horse world. I measured it in race victories, in trophies, in breeding records. Then a remarkable horse named Apollo, once known as Spirit, taught me that true success lies in letting beings be who they really are." She gestured to the large paddock behind her, where Apollo stood with his usual quiet dignity. At 48, Emma looked radiant beside him, her hand resting gently on his neck. The years of secrecy and struggle had transformed into a partnership that was changing the industry. "Today, we're not just opening a facility," Madison continued. "We're introducing a new way of thinking about our relationship with these magnificent animals. The Spirit Foundation represents a promise that every horse will have the freedom to choose its own path, whether that's competition, teaching, or simply living in peace." As if on cue, Apollo moved forward, Emma walking beside him. They approached the training track, where several young horses were being introduced to basic racing concepts. The crowd watched in amazement as Apollo, without any prompting, began demonstrating proper form. The younger horses observed intently, some mimicking his movements, others simply watching. "This is what we mean by choice." Emma took over the presentation, her voice filled with pride. Apollo wasn't forced back into racing, he chose to become a teacher, sharing his experience with younger horses who show an interest in the sport. "Other horses here have chosen different paths." She pointed to Starlight, now living peacefully in a natural paddock where she helped calm nervous new rescues. In another area, former racing horses worked with children in a therapeutic riding program. Each animal had found its own way to contribute, to be true to its nature. Victor Durham, who had become an integral part of their team, stepped forward to share the scientific validation of their approach. "Our research over the past year has shown that horses allowed to choose their activities show better health outcomes, stronger social bonds, and yes, for those who choose to race, better performance records." The presentation continued with testimonials from owners who had adopted their approach, stories of horses flourishing when given choices, of racing stables transformed into holistic care centers, of the industry slowly but surely evolving toward a more ethical future. As the formal ceremony concluded, Madison found herself back where everything had started, under the old oak tree that Apollo had claimed as his own that first day at the sanctuary. The horse approached her quietly, Emma at his side, and for a moment, the three of them stood in peaceful communion. "He knew," Madison said softly, stroking Apollo's forehead. "Somehow, he knew that we all needed to learn this lesson." Emma smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's the thing about truth. It finds a way to break free, just like Spirit did." Around them, the Spirit Foundation hummed with activity. New horses were arriving daily, each with their own story, their own path to discover. The racing world was watching their experiment closely, with more stables adopting their methods every month. "Madison," Ryan called out, approaching with excitement. "The National Racing Board just announced they're implementing our welfare guidelines as standard policy across all major tracks." The news washed over them like a wave of vindication. Everything they had fought for was taking root, growing into something larger than they had imagined. As the sun began to set on their first official day, Madison watched Apollo lead his herd, now expanded to include both retired champions and rescued horses, across the spacious grounds. He moved with the same grace he had shown on the racetrack, but there was something different now. A contentment, a completeness that no amount of victories could have provided. "You know," Emma said thoughtfully, "in trying to save Apollo, we ended up saving something much bigger, the spirit of what horses and humans can be together when we let truth and freedom lead the way." Madison nodded, feeling the rightness of their journey in her heart. The Spirit Foundation stood as a testament to that truth, a place where horses could be athletes or teachers, healers or simply themselves, their spirits unbound by human expectations. As twilight settled over the Kentucky hills, Apollo's distinctive neigh echoed across the grounds, no longer a sound of defiance or yearning, but of joy, of purpose found, of spirit freed. His story had begun in darkness, transformed through love and courage, and now stood as a beacon of hope for others to follow. In the end, it wasn't just about saving one horse or exposing one man's crimes. It was about rediscovering the pure and simple truth that had been there all along, that the greatest victory of all is the freedom to be exactly who you were meant to be,